Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to read chapter 35 from the third leg of the journey of the Seven Sisters from London to Salt Lake City. It's called Seven Sisters, the Trek, chapter 35. The two Indians galloped their horses for several silent miles. When they knew they were safely away from any pursuit, they slowed down to a trot and began talking, laughing, and even chirping jubilant cries skyward, seemingly about the white woman they had captured that afternoon. All this noisy celebrating woke Lavinia up. It took her a minute or two to figure out why she was on her stomach across a horse, feeling discomfort with each bounce. But then she remembered what had happened to her and noticed her hands and feet were bound. A flood of cold sweat instantly covered her body. She didn't dare move and let them know that she was awake. But after a few minutes, she got so uncomfortable and her head hurt so badly she couldn't stand it any longer. She started to shift around a little to find a better position for herself. When the Indians saw this movement, they quickly pulled to a stop and got off their horses. The one who was reining, Lavinia's horse, pulled her off roughly, and she fell to the ground, jarring her senses abruptly. She recovered quickly and struggled to a sitting position with terror in her heart. This was the first good luck she had gotten of her captors. The Indian on her horse was larger and older than the other one and had a long, crooked nose and full lips. His eyes were closely set, dark and steely. His hair was parted in the middle with a long braid down each side of his head. The smaller Indian had finer features and looked younger. He was more muscular than his fleshy companion. His hair was long and loose and had some feathers attached to a top knot. They looked different from the young Pawnee Indians who had stopped their wagon train early on in the Nebraska Territory. These were almost naked except for their breechcloths and ornately beaded and feathered breast shields. The two Indians mumbled back and forth as they approached and knelt down on either side of her. She was panic-stricken and became hysterical. "No, no, please, dear God," she screamed loudly, trying to deter them. She felt a sharp slap across her face, and her eyes flew open as the smaller Indian yelled something at her and placed the sharp edge of his knife at her throat. She closed her eyes and waited for death, or worse. The large Indian yelled sharply at his cohort, grabbed his wrist, and forced the knife away from Lavinia's throat. They each struggled to get the upper hand, while a squealing Lavinia clumsily scooted away from the fray. In the next few seconds, they were rolling around on the ground until the large Indian emerged on top, saddling the smaller one's waist and pinning his arms over his head. The smaller Indian kicked his legs, but they were too short to try to reach up and capture the large Indian's waist from behind. The large one was now yelling at the smaller one, who was trying to wiggle free, but was clearly outmuscled and outweighed. Finally, he just gave up and lay there. The large Indian threatened him loudly and continued to reprimand him. Then he gave a commanding order, got off the smaller Indian, and pulled him up. In an unexpected move, they hugged each other as though they had forgiven one another. Then they turned their attention back to Lavinia. The large Indian gave one last order, and the two started moving toward her again. She was sobbing in fear with her eyes closed. They knelt down and untied her legs. She felt her dress being lifted up. She sobbed. Her sobbing increased. Each Indian took a hold of one of her legs and arms, and to her utter amazement, they lifted her body up and guided her legs over and down each side of the horse. When she opened her eyes, she was sitting on top of the horse with her wrists still bound. A split second later, the large Indian swung up behind her, gathered up the reins, and encouraged his horse into a gallop. Lavinia groped for as much of the horse's mane as she could and pressed her knees into the sides of the horse. The Indian's arms were like bands of steel around her. The three rode for another hour, and when they reached the summit of a hill, they stopped and surveyed some teepees in a little valley below. After ear-splitting cries to alert the camp they were there, they rode down the hill into the camp amid whooping and chirping by the assembled tribe. Lavinia scanned the faces below her. Everyone had bright eyes and big smiles. This didn't make her feel any less afraid. The large Indian got off his horse and pulled Lavinia down to a standing position. This was the first time the two Indians had actually seen Lavinia fully standing up straight, and they marveled and laughed. She towered over both of them and everyone else in the camp. They had really captured a prize. Audible ahs, chirps, and chatter came from the women gathering around her, who began poking her with their fingers and touching her hair. "Ouch, please, stop, don't do that." Then a white-haired Indian, who appeared to be the head of the tribe, yelled something loudly, and the women parted obediently to let another woman in a white antelope skin robe walk up to Lavinia and take a closer look at her. Lavinia's hair had come loose from its usual prim bun during the course of the kidnapping, and now her front curls were straight and covering her eyes as she cried in miserable humiliation. The woman walked all the way around her and finally stopped in front. She pulled a knife out of the sheath on her belt. Lavinia cowered. "Please don't kill me," she said, as she raised her tied hands to a pleading position in front of her. Before she could comprehend what had happened, the woman slipped the knife between the rawhide binding and quickly sliced through it, freeing Lavinia's wrists. Her mouth fell open in disbelief. The tribe burst out cackling when they saw Lavinia's reaction. She was confused. What was going on? Were they going to kill her or just scare her to death, then kill her? She was petrified. After her inspection, the woman, who was clearly a favored member of the tribe, went and whispered something in the ear of the white-haired leader. He raised his hand and made a short statement. After that, the large Indian stepped up and began a very animated presentation to the tribe. Lavinia could only surmise he was describing the kidnapping when he demonstrated with his arms how he captured her. The listeners chirped and cackled. Then the leader stepped forward and took the large Indian's wrist in his right hand and walked with him toward Lavinia, where he took her left hand in his. Even though she wanted to pull her hand away, she didn't dare, since she was surrounded by the whole tribe. The chief started walking around the large campfire pit, holding both her hands up in the air. There was an uproar of jubilation and chanting from the tribe. The large Indian seemed triumphant as he strutted by the other tribesmen, who howled their loud approval. Lavinia reluctantly walked and didn't look up. After the congratulatory scene, Lavinia could only assume she had been given to the large Indian. She was terrified. She had no idea what was going to happen to her next. Then the leader surrendered his hold of her, and two women stepped to her side and took a hold of her arms, while several other women surrounded her like a fortress. She started to resist, but their grasp was uncomfortably tight. She could go no place but where they led her. They guided her to the largest teepee in the camp and took her inside. There they started to unbutton Lavinia's blouse and skirt and remove them. "What are you doing? I need my clothing. Please let me go," she begged as she flailed around, trying to slap them away. The next thing she knew, one of the women punched her in the stomach so hard that she bent over in severe pain. She couldn't move, and they took full advantage of this incapacitation to cut off all her undergarments while she fought for breath. When she finally caught some air, she sputtered and coughed as she tried to cover her nakedness with her hands and arms. These Indians were heartless. Lavinia felt thoroughly degraded. She felt shame and indignity from the demeaning treachery that was being perpetrated on her, but she couldn't do anything but stand there with her head down and sob silently. Then she heard some chatter and looked up to see one of the women approaching with a white buckskin dress in her arms, similar to the one the favored tribeswoman had on, only this one was covered with rows and rows of ivory elk teeth on the front. As the women dressed her, she became a little more cooperative because she was once again being covered. The soft buckskin felt so smooth on her skin that it almost comforted her in her time of need. They next forced her to sit down on a buffalo robe that was on the dirt floor, and retied her hands behind her back, securing them to a post that was near one side of the tent. Then two women put a moccasin on each of her feet, tied her ankles together, and left the teepee. She was finally alone, but for how long? She could only imagine the worst. Was she pledged to this red man? Was she already married? It didn't seem like any wedding ceremony she had ever attended. Was this her wedding night? Would her husband come in to her later to consummate the marriage? She had scant knowledge about the Marriage Act. Her mother had only taught her that it was a necessary evil in order to have children, and before marriage she needed to guard her virtue at all costs. But maybe the wedding wasn't until tomorrow. The uncertainty of everything was overwhelming. Maybe she could get away. She tested her bindings. They were impossibly tight. She twisted her wrists until she couldn't stand the chafing any longer. Her bands seemed to get tighter. She had to think. Her mind raced. She had always wanted to get married, but the opportunity had never presented itself in the remote part of Northampton where she lived. She had to take care of her invalid parents for many years before they finally succumbed to diphtheria. She wasn't free to leave them, really, and her two brothers refused to help. So she was stuck there in the countryside with no opportunity to meet eligible men. Besides that, what man wanted to take on someone who was considerably older than marriageable age and childbearing age, and who was responsible for aging parents? Now Lavinia had someone who wanted to marry her, but he was undeniably from another world. What would her life be like if she were married to an Indian? She couldn't fathom it. The language barrier alone would make it impossible. She was so exhausted, so strained, so drained that she put her head down on the soft buffalo robe and dissolved into sleep. Caroline and Hurricane followed the tracks of the Indians' horses, only stopping when they couldn't decipher the hoof marks on rocky places. They often had to scout around to see where the tracks were visible again. They crossed two streams and had to pick up the trail on the other side. Hurricane was a natural at tracking, but it was starting to get dusky. "Pull up, Caroline," Hurricane said. "I see some smoke coming up over that hill. Do you think it's a camp?" "It could be. Let's lead our horses up there. We don't want to bound over the top and be seen by anyone below." The horses seemed to be glad to walk as they shook their heads and gave guttural whinnies, which sounded a lot like sighs of relief. They had been running for several hours and had served their riders well. Caroline and Hurricane cautiously walked up the hill a little way and tied their horses to some bushes. Then they crouched over and made their way to some rocks that were clustered around the top. Caroline was so glad she had changed out of her skirt and into Hurricane's pants. She could never have done all this in a skirt. As she peered over the rocks, she adjusted Lavinia's hat brim so she could see better. There in the valley below was a small Indian camp set up near some trees. There were several smoke streams curling up from the various campfires and a little creek meandering past it. Caroline counted 9 teepees. "Do you think Lavinia's down there?" "She has to be. We followed the tracks to here, so we've got to assume she is." "But where?" "She's probably in one of the teepees. It will be dark soon. Then we can move closer. In the meantime, we can observe the activity of the camp and see if we can determine where she is." The camp was bustling because the women were cooking their evening meals. The children were running and playing, and some were getting water from the stream for their mothers. The men were less visible, but there were a few young boys tending the herd of horses on the far side of the camp. Caroline watched for a while and then began yawning. "Oh, my goodness, I am sleepy." "Why don't you take a nap? We've had a hard ride. I'll keep watch." Caroline was grateful for this invitation and looked for a spot to rest her head. "Use my leg for a pillow," Hurricane offered. Would it be all right?" "Sure, go ahead." Caroline felt silly about this offer, but she wasn't going to turn it down. She took off Lavinia's hat, curled up beside him, and put her head on his leg and fell asleep in no time. Hurricane smiled as he studied her face and golden hair, which was pulled back and falling down her back. He figured her skin was once probably very creamy before she came on this trip, but now it was sunburned and peeling on her nose and cheeks. She had a split bottom lip, no doubt from smiling with dry, chapped lips. Her brown eyelashes fanned out from her lids and made her look like a sleeping child who had been out in the sun too long. There was no mistaking her for a child, however. Her beauty and maturity were evident, and she hadn't let her comely appearance or life of luxury affect her. She was unlike any of the girls he knew in southern Utah. After a half-hour's nap, Hurricane gently awakened Caroline. She was a little startled until she remembered where she was and what she and Hurricane were doing. Did anything happen while I was asleep? They've eaten their suppers. Are you hungry? I'm starving. Hurricane got up and rubbed his thigh as he limped over to his horse. He had been sitting in the same position too long. Here's some jerky to chew on, he said upon returning. Caroline couldn't believe how good the dried meat tasted. As my ma says, quoted Hurricane drolly, hunger is the best cook. That is so true, agreed Caroline. I've eaten some disgusting things on this journey, but I was so hungry by the time I ate them, they tasted like a delicacy for a queen. Hurricane chuckled and joined her in her simple repast. The night air was filled with sounds of frogs, crickets, and a hooting owl. Hurricane noticed some chanting starting up from the camp below. What's that? Asked Caroline. I'm not sure, but it sounds like they're getting ready for some ceremony or celebration, and it probably involves Lavinia. Here's what we're going to do. I think it's dark enough to make our move. We'll sneak up to the back of each tent and cut a little hole so we can peek in and see if she's there. Let's just hope we find her without having to look in every single tent. She probably won't be alone. Have you thought of that? I've thought about it all right, and I've decided I'm just going to leave that part of the plan in the Lord's hands. That's the perfect thing to do. That's all we can do. Let's say a prayer before we go down there. I'll say it. They both knelt down and faced each other. Dear Lord, he began earnestly, please bless us as we undertake the rescue of our dear sister in the gospel, Lavinia Triplet. May we have thy Holy Spirit to guide us where to go and what to do in this dangerous task. Bless that we will be protected and that we can rescue her from her captors without harm to ourselves or harm to those who have her in their midst. We ask this in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Caroline had tears in her eyes. That was a wonderful prayer, she said as she reached across and hugged him. This surprised Hurricane, but he felt the need for a reassuring hug himself and wrapped his arms around her and hugged her back. It felt so good to have this comfort for a few seconds. Breaking apart, he spoke seriously. You've got your gun? Yes, it's in my pocket. Each chamber is loaded? Yes. Follow me then, and be ready for anything. This caused Caroline to feel a charge of fear go through her body, but then she remembered the prayer Hurricane had given and knew she had to turn her trust over to the Lord. And that's chapter 35. Over and out.